I'm here alone right now, physically. However, my interlocutor for this next section is the incredible photographer, Deana Lawson. Deana currently has a show up at the Guggenheim in New York because she is the recipient of this year's Hugo Boss Prize. And she also has a show up at Sycamore Jenkins. So if anyone's in New York, go and check out those shows because it's a really great moment to be looking at her photographs. And Deana, I'm so glad you're here today because what we're going to do is talk about the extraordinary photographer, Diane Arbus. And I have to say, when I look at her pictures, I think about your pictures. And so I'm so thrilled that you were willing to take time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. And I should also say to everyone who's watching, Deana is in LA and I'm in New York. And so we are being brought together by this magic technology. I hear Deana in my ear, but I see her on a screen that's right next to the camera. So just so you guys all understand the setup. But Deana, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's wonderful to be here. And I just remember in 1999 first seeing Diane Arbus's work in a slideshow in a classroom, and it was an analog slideshow on a carousel, and being completely astonished and curious about the work, the way in which she was able to make the familiar appear unfamiliar and the unfamiliar appear familiar, really stuck with me. It's so interesting because we're from completely different backgrounds. Diane Arbus comes from a affluent Jewish background on the Upper East Side of New York in the 1930s. And I come from Rochester, New York, Black American background in the 1990s. But however distant that background is, there's a communion in the artwork, in the photographs. And in that sense, I see Diane as a kindred spirit and as an ancestor. So it's wonderful to be in conversation with you.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because I have to say, I think that's one of the great miracles of great art is that it allows us to connect with one another across time, across geography, across class, across, who our ancestors are in the world. Like there's something about these objects that lets us talk to each other through them. And Arbus's photographs are so extraordinary because, as you say, she was born in the early 20s, which means she's the generation of Rauschenberg and Ellsworth Kelly and Jasper Johns, and she died in the early 1970s, so she hasn't been around for a long time. And yet, somehow the pictures still have this quality where they're so arresting. Here's a woman who knows nothing of the internet, doesn't really even know the fullness of the women's movement, much less the gay rights movement, and yet these pictures still have this capacity to I don't know how else to say it, but then to arrest one, to shatter one's sense of oneself. And I wonder, as someone who makes pictures, what do you think that is in the picture that is allowing it to move through time that way?
Tina Camp talks about the haptic in photography, about photography not being just images, but also a sense of touch, right? Like photographs are handled. There's a humanity in them. And I feel like Diane Arbus's gaze, and the haptic, the touch is psychological as well as emotional, which gives me that sense of intimacy that communicates, like you said, across time and space.
I love that you say that the haptic is one of my favorite art history words of all time, because there really is no other word that fills in. So just for anyone who doesn't out there who doesn't know what the haptic means, the haptic is when something is it's like velvet or corduroy is a perfect idea of the haptic. It's something that you can look at and understand its texture without touching it. So the idea that something could have a quality of being emotionally haptic is really beautiful, right? That there's a kind of emotional texture to the pictures that we apprehend even if we can't give it language, or we apprehend it even if we don't fully understand it.
Beautifully said.
So I wanted to, one of the things that Arbus said about her own pictures or about photographs, and you are such a great photographer, Deana, she said that photographs are a secret about a secret. And I have to say, when I read it, I was like, damn, that is a really good description of a Deana Lawson photograph. You know, that, especially because your photographs don't appear constructed. They appear like as if they were always there, but we know that you carry props, you find people, you work with your sitters to get them into these very extraordinary situations. So when you hear like that Arbus thought a photograph was a secret about a secret, how does that, like, what does that do to your brain?
I totally identify with that quote. That is one of the reasons why I tend to photograph alone, actually. There's very few people that have accompanied me on photo shoots, but I feel like there's like not only a vulnerability in imaging the subject, but there's also a vulnerability in that moment, and it's in flux and it hasn't crystallized, and it's a sacred space. I often imagine it to be, and I even imagine the photographic process as a somewhat of a ceremony in a way, or like my own sort of ritual. But yeah, there's just the unexpected, the things that yeah, I'm not sure how to further expand on that, but yes, that is I totally identify with that.
It makes sense to me that you would identify it. And I wonder too, like, one of the things in the Arbus literature, and so many people have written about her, so many great people have said really interesting things about her. And people talk about how she takes pictures of people looking at her. You know, that she's somehow capable of creating a kind of reverb or a circular version of the gaze. Like she's looking at someone, and clearly she could be choosing from a contact sheet moments where they're not looking at her, but she tends to choose images where people return the gaze to her. And I'm curious how that reads to you as a photographer, because you too, a lot of people in your pictures look very frankly back at the camera. Is that something you tease out from them? Is that something you choose? How does that come to be?
It really depends on the particular picture or the moment. But what I'll say is, for me, the gaze is about an agency and the subject, a power that I want to really highlight. You have Sons of Krish up on the screen at the moment, and I think what's interesting is that there are two gazes. There, one of the newborn child,
Nice.
the daughter, and the ice blue dress, and then there's the father, who's a beautiful man who has these piercing eyes. And these are ideas I was exploring regarding fatherhood, Black masculinity, relationships, family, and how that might materialize in the image.
It's so true. And of course, in Sons of Kush, you also have those family photographs, on the table. And he is, like he is smoking hot, that guy. I mean, it's also this moment where you kind of don't know. I always feel very almost embarrassed in front of Sons of Kush because I'm like, I feel like I've lost my objectivity as a critic or a historian just because the man is so beautiful and he's got these bedroom eyes, but he's holding a baby. He's surrounded in a family. He's in a family way, and I'm curious. One of the things that rhymes with me about Arbus's photographs is she seems to really understand that people, even though she's capturing them in a moment, and that moment opens out into their wholeness. But she seems to really understand the wholeness, the whole messy complexity of a person. Even as she makes an image that's kind of quick and iconic. These two things, I don't know, do you experience those two things as being in tension with one another in an Arbus photograph? Or are they commensurate? Like, I'm curious how you relate to those ideas.
Yeah, I think particularly with the image a young Brooklyn family going for a Sunday outing,
Yeah.
there's a clear intention to not force anything, but also to not hide anything. And I think to me that's the tension point. Um, the gazes here are so profound.
Yeah.
Really, the only direct eye contact is that of a father.
Yeah.
The arc of the mother's eye contact is right past the camera. The baby is looking out. And then Richard Jr., the son, so this particular photograph, Diane Arbus makes a note that the son is developmentally disabled. And it is, even before reading that note, I sense the disability just because of the lack of the gaze, or maybe the lack of control of the gaze. And, Deana Arbus has this famous quote that I'm sure you've read, but she says, our whole guise is like giving a sign to the world to think of us in a certain way, but there's a point between what you want people to know about you and what you can't help people knowing about you. And I just think this photograph of the family, it just resonates personally, even just because as a twin, I've often talked about having a twin sister who has multiple sclerosis and who developed a disability later in life, and always trying to mitigate the obviousness of her disability and what that means. What does that mean as a young family raising a disabled child, and how might that be isolating in a way? But Deanne doesn't hide from that. She doesn't force it, but she doesn't try to conceal anything. It's just beautiful. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if you have
No,
any-
that's great. I mean, I think one of the things I too really love that photograph, it's here in the gallery right now. And one of the things I've always loved about this photograph is, well, there's definitely something in the father's gaze that I think you're right. He is being very open and vulnerable. He knows this is it. This kid is going to have a harder road than other kids, which means in some way he as a father might be having a harder road. Like there's this way that Arbus photographs human difficulty, human frailty, the hardness of the world, not in a way that causes the viewer to have pity or anything saccharine like that, right? Because pity sometimes implies that you're above, right? Like you can pity somebody, right? If you're up here, but rather that it's this frank acknowledgement, like the world can be a very difficult and unfair place. And we all deal, like you play the hand you dealt, right? Like, and that's sort of what I feel about this family is, Like there's something, Bart talks about the punctum, like the moment in the photograph that pierces you, that cuts through it all. And for me, it's her eyebrows. Like,
Yeah.
right? Like those eyebrows say, I am going out and I'm going to wear this leopard skin coat and I'm going to have my bag and we've got these 2 kids and maybe getting all 4 of us out the door was like a situation. But my eyebrows are done because we are going out, and there's something about that quality of the image that it kind of breaks me open. I feel, kind of cracks me open sometimes.
Absolutely. This is a very well put together woman. Like you said, the glamorous eyebrows, the hair that's beautifully coiffured and done. She has her handbag in the leopard print. But then something about the eyes that are not necessarily happy, or that there's discomfort there. There's a longing or something. I'm not sure what it is, but it breaks this sort of like presentation of self,
Right.
The public self versus the private self. And it's so interesting that Deanne was able to capture such an intimate moment in a exterior space. This is not like a family portrait in a living room on the couch. They're outside and about to get in their car, and she managed to, through her gaze, capture this moment that, so natural, and so on stage.
She, a lot of her most famous photographs are of people outside. If you think about the little boy with the grenade, or that last body of work that she did at the, the Institute for the Developmentally Disabled. So many of those figures are outside. I wonder if you could just talk about, from like a geeky camera point of view, she uses a Rolleiflex. So she's never, there's no moment where the camera's in front of her face. It's in her belly, sort of. And do you use a Rolleiflex? Could you tell me just a little bit about what you think it means that she's not using a 35 millimeter camera, that she's lugging around this like heavy piece of equipment that's right in her body?
It's interesting because it's a waist level viewfinder, which you kind of hold it by your gut, like you think of a gut, the intuition or something. The light comes through the lens and it's reflected up into a focusing screen. So you don't have to look directly at the subject in front of you. You're looking down. And I mean, of course, that Diane Arbus, she begins to photograph in her early career with a 35 millimeter. And she's very much interested in grain, like grainy prints. But then she has the class with Lisette Nordell, who talks about, the specificity. But then if the more specific you are, the more general it will become. And then there's a shift in Diane Arbus's approach. Formally, she goes to the medium format, which is clearer, sharper. But she not only does she use a medium format, but she's also using often the wide angle lens, and a wide angle tends to distort towards key edges, especially if you get close up to a subject. With a wide angle, it actually distorts the face a little bit. So I think also the uncanny strangeness also has to do with the lens choice that she's using.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard anyone talk about that use of the wide angle. What do you think it means that she's not making eye contact with her sitters and that she's looking down? What, as someone who takes pictures, what do you think is happening there?
That's interesting because I use a Pentax 6.7 medium format as well as a 4x5 and 8x10 large format, and you actually do look through the viewfinder. And later on, she talks about buying a Pentax 6.7 and trying to figure out how to relate to it because it's a rectangle rather than a square. I wonder if it has somewhat to do with the blind spot. When you click that shutter, you don't necessarily see what's happening. Like there's a temporary blind spot. I wonder if it's a sense of looking but not looking, and maybe the subject feeling a bit more comfortable since they don't feel that you're looking at them directly through the camera.
That's interesting. Okay, can we do just another geeky moment? So you said square. I feel like I'm so lucky. It's like a master class. Square format. Arbus is kind of really known for using the square format. She doesn't use portrait. She doesn't use landscape. To use the square format is really extraordinary. And if we look at one of the other pictures in this gallery, which is the sword swallower, I think there she's really exploiting the square, like sort of brilliantly. I mean, like literally the figure and the figure's doing this and the sword's coming down, and it's almost like she's dividing a square into more squares, like she's letting you see all the symmetry that's possible in the square format. The incredible like solidness, the balance. So even though the subject matter might make you feel off kilter, the form of the picture is like solid. What do you think that square format is doing for her? It's like, for instance, you don't use it. You use a more standard, quote unquote, rectangular format. What's that choice for you, and what do you think the square choice is for Arbus?
The rectangular format associates with narrative. And I think the square format feels more like document in a way. I think also, if you go back to the image of the albino sword swallower at a carnival, I'm so happy you pointed out this print, because if you look at the edges of this, like, I really love Diane Arbus's edges. Like they're soft, they're not sharp. And this actually goes to how she's, not only the format, but how she's printing.
Right.
And in that way, I feel like there's these aberrations or these idiosyncrasies. They're not, if it was sharp, it would feel a bit colder. But in some ways, I feel like her print also has this humanity or this grace to it. It feels like it's been handled. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, I think it's really important to see Diane Arbus's work in person, which I wish I was there right now, because her printing is just also very singular. And I just feel her care, her humanness, the imperfection in the print.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. I have to say, I've never really thought about those soft edges in her work. And you're right, there is something like the figure is so sharp, but the place she puts them in has this little bit of like gentleness. And that is, I think one of the things that great pictures do is that they put this contradiction in front of you, and that contradiction becomes a simultaneous contradiction. It's not like if, then, or and, or it's like both and, like, and you can't get out of that space. And I realize that that's part of how the pictures are working. I want to read you this quote from her daughter, Dune. Dune Arbus writes that Arbus, and I love this quote so much, she says she surrendered authority for tenderness. And I mean, all of it, like surrendered authority, tenderness. Those are such extraordinary words. And it, I wonder too, like, I mean, I'm just so interested in like your shared DNA, because I feel like your pictures have a ton of authority. Like some of the people in your photographs they really hold that space. Like that space is theirs. But the gaze that you have toward them is so tender. I don't know. I don't know where to go with that other than to, we're showing Chief right now on the screen. I can see it on my screen. And the way he occupies that. And there you are. Deana Lawson, can we just have a a quick moment about how you are the master of the corner. Like, my God, look at that. Look at all of the direction and energy of that photograph, like totally zooming into the corner there so that man can then radiate out his energy and fill up all that empty space in front of him. That is just extraordinary. Yeah. So
Thank you.
do you have anything to say about authority and tenderness? I'll let you go for a second.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it's interesting that Chief was shown after a albino sword swallower, because there in that photograph with the albino sword swallower, there's the in between of elsewhere and here. This sort, like, you see the tent behind her. It's sort of rigged up. You see a trailer, and you get the sense of this, like, very much like temporal moment or transient moment where this carnival could end and things are packed up. But then there's this elsewhere moment of this figure blowing in the wind, who has this sort of mysticism or religiosity because of this cross, which it is the same sort of like sense that I get with Chief, with the curtain blowing and this in-between space of being in a tradition of Yoruba and ancient Ghanaian spirituality versus the Christ figure above him, and also this all the adornment of royalty and confidence, but then his gaze, his arms are not like the most like confident or not the most like authoritative. And so, like, I think that's where the tension comes in, between this idea of presentation of self and ideas of self, and in between spaces, myth, earth, etc. But so
I wonder if we could talk about just a little bit how Arbus is in some way clearly collaborating with her sitters, right? There's something going on between them. This isn't, the candid moment, it's not a snapshot aesthetic. Like, clearly there's a setup that's happening. And there's also clearly a setup in your work. And it occurs to me that maybe one of the things both of your pictures do, and I'm curious how you'll respond to this, is like, we are only ever ourselves for and with others. Like this idea that you're somehow a self without others is kind of bunk. You know what I mean? It might be how you feel, but it's not really true. And I guess I'm curious in terms of making pictures of people, like, is that part of the dynamic that we are, when we get dressed, when we come correct, like that woman is come correct. She's doing that for herself, but she's doing it for others, so she can see herself as correct in others' eyes to be, reflected back toward her, if that makes sense. Just how the gaze is always moving around, I guess, is maybe what I'm after.
And then it's I've photographed individuals, and I've talked about this before, who you say they look different in the photograph that I make of them than how they might look in reality. I also have spoken with subjects who feel, because they've been looked at, because I've approached them and asked to take their picture, they feel also a sense of flattery or honor, and this sort of need to want to present and want to collaborate and present themselves in a particular way. I think there is something about being looked at, the the effect of being looked at by a person, by a camera, and like how that changes the presentation of who you are. And I think that it also circles back to what we talked about in the beginning about the haptic.
Okay, so, there's lots of folks out on the internet watching us. So I have some questions from folks who are online. Okay. All right. This is one for you, Deana, about Sons of Cush. And the question is, what is the meaning or import of the hand and the cash off to the side of the image? Was that purposely placed there, and how or why? Is that an interesting sort of punctum in that photograph?
Absolutely. Cash money. No, yeah, there's an image I did in Alabama. It's titled Trap Car. And I was thinking about, ways of getting money and thinking about this particular subject. He has his baby. There's this connection between him and his daughter. And then he also has this connection with this person on the side. And, who knows how money is made or what implications are there. But we have to contend with both of those worlds in this photograph. The angelic baby, the way of getting cash, the tattoos, the gold, the photographs of the family members, the poster in the background of the biblical map. You have to contend with all that's there. And yes, the cash is a punctum. In addition to that, thinking about images, what I said with Diane Arbus's work, I noticed that I tended to center the subject in my work, and I wanted to sort of experiment with the edge of the frame and see what happens in a conversation in the frame if you put these two elements together. It's interesting because actually I had planned to photograph these two subjects on different occasions. But then in a sort of eureka moment, I decided to collapse both photo shoots into one.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. For me, the punctum in that photograph, I love how the punctum is always different for everybody. But for me, the punctum is the fact that that little kind of window inset on the door is covered from the inside. Like that to me, I'm like, oh, okay. So we're inside, we get this little moment of vulnerability. But if you are outside of this bad boy, you are outside. Like shade drawn, window covered. Yeah, it really, I'm always entranced by that moment in the picture. Did you put that there?
Yeah, I did not. It just makes me think of the duct tape and how duct tape can be used to rig up. I mean, here is blue tape, but
Right.
how the folks, particularly Black folks, how we rig things up and make things work. If we need to shield out the world, we don't need to buy, curtain from J.C. Penney. We could just put up foil and some duct tape, and bam. So,
That's a
here,
good segue into the last question that we have time for. It's another question for you about your work. It says, Deana, how do you think your work has contributed to shifting narratives about African Americans in our culture? And was it your intention to shift that narrative with your work?
yes. Initially, it was not my intention. Initially, my intention was to make photographs of people in my direct community who I always found beautiful. But what I will say is that I feel Blackness is a plural term. It's a dynamic term. It's a verb. It's an action principle. It's a frequency. It's a vibration. And whatever I can do is, a person who makes photographs to always tease out that dynamicism is what I am going to do.
I really love that. I love that you ended with blackness as this constellation of activities and practices and feelings, and that you started with Arbus as one of your kind of aesthetic ancestors. I think that is just so, so beautiful. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today in this little experiment. And I saw your work yesterday, and I just want to tell you, Deana Lawson, keep making those amazing photographs, man. They are spectacular, and they are in the canon along with Diane Arbus. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane Arbus. Thank you, Helen Molesworth. And thank you, David Warner Gallery,